Hello and welcome to episode 43 of Refining Rhetoric. This is your host, Robert Bortons. I'm excited to be interviewing David Goodwin. He is a co-author of the book, The Battle for the American Mind, Uprooting a Century of Miseducation. You can find the documentary on Fox Nation. He co-wrote it with Pete Hegseth, but David is a good friend, and we talk about classical education, writing a New York Times bestseller, and what are ACCS schools. So let's tune in.
Classical Conversation Studios presents Refining Rhetoric with CEO Robert Bortons, a podcast where faith, business, politics, and classical education meet. Join us as we use the classical tools of rhetoric to seek truth in every arena of life.
Today, my guest is David Goodwin. David is the president of ACCS, that's the Association of Classical Christian Schools, and the managing director of the Classical Difference magazine. Prior to leading ACCS, David co-founded and served as a headmaster of the Ambrose School, a classical Christian school in Idaho, and one of the leading examples of classical Christian education in the nation. Recently, David and ACCS helped produce the Miseducation of America with Pete Hegseth of Fox News. And this 6-part docuseries exposes how progressive ideals have seeped their way into our nation's schools. In addition, David co-authored the book with Pete called The Battle for the American Mind, Uprooting a Century of Miseducation, published in 2022. And the book has since then become a #1 New York Times bestseller. David, congratulations and welcome to the show.
Well, thank you very much, Robert. It's good to see you again.
It's good to see you too. David, we're asking all of our guests to define truth here on our podcast. So we'll just throw you a softball to get started.
A softball. Boy, that's hard to put in just a few words. I suppose maybe one way I think of truth that's a little bit unique is that I think that what Jesus Christ and the Lord have given us is a narrative, a story that begins in Genesis and runs right up to this moment. And because of that, we have the luxury of not treating truth just like facts. They're not just facts, a giraffe has spots or whatever. Truth is actually anything that fits in to the narrative that God has written for us. And so our task is both to find that narrative, find that, which is largely given to us through Scripture and, of course, through the church. But find that narrative, find that story that we're told, and then arrange the facts into it as they fit. And I think that's where truth fits.
That's wonderful. We always think about, we always hear today in our modern culture about your truth or, that's okay for you, but not for everyone else. But really it's identifying the facts that match what we know to be true historically. So I appreciate that definition.
Yes.
Classical education, you've been in it for a long time. We've been in it for a while. It's kind of a fringe movement, but now it seems to be going mainstream. And you guys even partnered with Pete Hegseth and Fox Nation for the Miseducation of America. My mom Lee was in it for a while. So why the title Miseducation? Like, how did you come up with that idea?
Well, as most Miseducation, the documentary, I think Fox came up with it.
Yeah.
It was really their choice. But I liked it. I thought it really fit well. It's a little gentle for a term as to what they really did. I mean, really the progressives hijacked education, completely seized control of it, and then turned it to their purposes. So there's more, I suppose, bolder words you could use, but miseducation fits.
Wonderful. So you said it's changed, or the left has hijacked it. So how do schools differ today than maybe they have historically, or how they should be designed?
Well, that's a really good question. What started this whole thing was research I did after seeing a 1914 article written in the New Republic. Actually, it was 1915, I think. Written in the New Republic about this plan that the progressives had to replace what at the time was classical Christian education, because that was the dominant means of education prior to the turn of the 20th century, to replace it entirely with progressive education. And they had a big challenge, but they had a big plan as well. The big challenge was there was no government entity that completely controlled education. So they were going to have to seize all of the elements of kind of bureaucratic control of the educational system, which became the public school system as we now know it. But prior to that, in the colonial era, there was pretty much straightforward classical Christian education as you and I would see it. It entailed the that children learned to read from the Bible. They read the great books, as many as they had. Obviously, in those days, it was harder to get your hands on books, but they would read these great books, and that's the way in which they train their children to think and train the virtues of their children. Some vestige of that continued on through to the 20th century, right there at the late 1800s time frame, when the progressives decided to redirect it to their purposes. And now the oddity was they were so thorough with it, and maybe because nobody really was watching education, they were watching politics or something else, it was easy for them to swap out that classical education for modern progressive education.
Yeah, it's always interesting to see whenever the news, like right now with the bank failures going on and different things, like, okay, the news is telling us this. What is that trying to distract us from? Or even if it's not intentional, what is it, the things that we should be paying attention to? Now, when I first got into classical education, this has its own grammar, as we call it, but the term paideia might be something a school teacher may recognize, but it's used in the book and in the documentary, and of course, we love and have the book The Paideia of God by Douglas Wilson as reading for classical conversations families. But what does paideia mean?
Well, paideia is a Greek word, so you won't find it in most English dictionaries. But the reason it was widely understood prior to, again, the 1900s was because most educated people were educated in Greek, and so they just used the Greek term, which is sort of translated education, but it exists in the Bible in Ephesians 6, where God tells us to educate our fathers to educate their children in the fear and admonition of the Lord. That's one translation. Those words come from paideia. I counted 7 different translation words used in there: instruction, discipleship, many others. The translators have a hard time with the word because there is no English translation for it. And so as we wrote the book, Pete and I, paideia is the center of education, and it takes education from being a simple training that you do to give kids a job to a great big thing that impacts every area of life and family. And so because it's such a big word, it's hard to define. And obviously, both in the book and in the video series, they asked me to define it a number of ways. In the book, I define it as, I say, paideia simply defined represents the deeply seated affections, thinking, viewpoint, and virtues embedded in children at a young age, or more simply, the rearing, molding, and education of a child. So this is, it's involving virtue, viewpoints, thought, and these things called affections, which when you get into the classical world, as I know you know, Rob, the Augustinian influence through time, he's the one who came up with this, or he really was kind of a Greek idea, but sure, he replaces it into Christianity, and he says that our rightly ordered affections are what make us who we are. What we love is who we are. And so that's the idea of what educators should be doing, is focusing on bringing children to love the right things and to love the right things in the right order.
Yeah, I think C.S. Lewis said, when first things are placed first, second things aren't lowered, they're elevated. So, that's great. What has this Western Christian Paideia, has been removed from our government schools? There's classical schools that are, going back to the lost tools of learning, as some of us refer to it. Of course, here at Classical Conversations, that's one of our favorite essays to read. So what ideas have replaced these Western Christian Paideia in schools?
The Western Christian Paideia. So Paideia is a general term for any civilization, any tribe you find anywhere in the world has a Paideia for their children. When the Greeks came up with the identified term of Paideia, they sought to make it an intentional, purposeful training for children to be free citizens. And so initially, it was much about being self-governing in the Greek democracy and then in the Roman Republic. The Western Christian Paideia is a much evolved version of that Paideia, which the Greeks believed that the virtues of the citizens would sustain the democracy. The Christians sought virtue for its own sake. And so the Western Christian Paideia is really the form of the Paideia that shaped up around the first, second century. And the first, second century Christians were classically educating at the time. And so they carried it forward, and it survived up until the progressives sought to unseat it from America right around 1915. And they sought to do this because it competed, just like Marx said religion was the opiate of the people. They saw the same point with the Western Christian Paideia. It was in the way of them transforming society into something they wanted to control. They wanted to make society this utopian place, and every time they ran into a roadblock, it happened to be from the Western Christian Paideia. So they sought to remove the instrument that created that Paideia, or as C.S. Lewis puts it in The Abolition of Man, remove the organ and then bid the children to be fruitful, which is not, that's a paraphrase, obviously, for what he really said.
Why are you against a utopia?
We're never promised utopia by God. We're promised blessings if we live with righteousness, and that's a very different thing than a utopia. It doesn't mean that you will live in any state of perfection in this world with the sin that's here.
So what do you see as the next steps, either as an individual or society? How do we, regain what is lost?
In terms of education and the Western Christian Paideia?
Yeah, in terms of education.
Well, historically, this problem has been around for a very long time. There have been a number of times in history. I mentioned one, I think. I know you're probably familiar with it, where Charlemagne, way back in the 8th century, 9th century, maybe, he had tried to conquer the German tribes. Neither the Romans nor the medievals could conquer these tribes. They were tremendously fierce and basically unconquerable. So he sent a guy by the name of Alcuin, who was a monk from Britain, into Germany to start schools in monasteries and train the children. And as the children came to become Christians and learn the Western Christian Paideia, they were able to civilize the German people, the Germanic people. So it would be, most of Northern Europe.
Sure.
That is what we're going to have to do today. We've lost our civilization, I think. I think you and I both got into this. The funny thing is, as you pointed out, people are now just coming to classical education and going, we really need this, because the country's, since 2020, it's turned into a crazy place. But you and I started this long before that, because we saw a crazy place coming. We knew it was not, where people were going was not good. We knew the worship of self and the worship of individualism was going nowhere good. And so I think classical education is the only real classical Christian education. And when I say that, I don't want to replace Christianity with it. I'm just saying it's discipleship is the center of Christianity, and discipleship is what education is. So the discipleship of future generations with a Western Christian Paideia is the ultimate answer, I think, to restoring and returning some of what we had as a nation and as a people. But that's not going to be simple, nor is it going to be fast. So a lot of people, for a long time, I think, resisted classical Christian education because it seemed like it was a throwback to old times and maybe irrelevant today, et cetera. And now suddenly it's relevant because they realize that the hearts and minds of our kids are being corrupted in some of the most abhorrent ways, all around us.
Mm-hmm.
Kids walking by on the street. I mean, it's a blessing in many ways to have a. I think it's a blessing to have. I have to say this carefully because, of course, none of us would want what's coming
Sure.
coming from the world right now. We wouldn't wish that on our worst enemies. But one nice thing about it is it's a clear call to righteousness.
Well, I think Ronald Reagan said if a foreign entity imposed the education system on the United States, we would have declared that an act of war on us. And that was in the 80s. And of course, back even then, Christians were still, the start of the homeschool and classical, renewal movement were just in its infancy. So, David, we've been working on this for a long time. I don't know that I ever imagined a classical education book being a #1 New York Times bestseller. But why do you think this topic resonated with so many people?
Well, it's interesting. The story of how it came to be was that Pete contacted me probably around January of 2020 to try and figure out. He'd been at a diner doing his man on the street interviews, and somebody suggested he should look into classical education. So he called me on that recommendation, and I sent him a couple of chapters of the book, which had already been written at that point, or at least parts of it had. And to answer some of his questions, I think he was looking more for sort of a patriotic kind of educational forum. And that's why the Western Christian Paideia was such an important thing, is that I kind of steered us away from patriotic, even though patriotism can be a very good thing, but it's not the main thing. And so he was convinced and said, hey, is there anything I can do to help to get the word out? And I said, well, we've always wanted a documentary on this. So he said, well, I think Fox might be willing to do that. So he started work on that. Well, in the meantime, you can tell from the timing, this was before COVID. And so COVID hits. And so we're working on, writing the script and doing all this stuff right through the beginning of COVID. And then along comes June of 2020, and the world goes crazy. George Floyd and the aftermath, and then following that, the BLM movement all over the spectrum. And it was one of those moments where Fox kept upping the ante on the documentary and saying, we want to do more, because education had become front and center. And of course, we know that in the election, I think it was that year, in Virginia, education became a central thing. And so Fox elevated it up. We just finished season 2 just a few weeks back. That's the one your mother, of course, was in. And they did season 2 because season 1 was the most downloaded or the most binge watched show on Fox. So there was suddenly a realization that this was a big topic. And it was about then in June, July, August of 2020 that HarperCollins contacted us, said they wanted to do a piece on it. So as we wrote the book, I wrote the core of the book, and Pete wrote the big parts of it as well. Particularly, Pete was very helpful on the Frankfurt School and the critical theory stuff and a lot of the material in it. But we wrote the book together, and then by the time we released it in 2021, this stuff had all reached a fever pitch. So it shot to the top of the New York Times list, I think providentially, because God, there was this time frame when the only time in history an education book could become #1 is when things suddenly call for it at that moment. And of course, a lot of it was Fox getting behind it. But they were just kind of drafting into the wind because that's where the country was headed at that point. And I think that's why it's got legs. It's continuing to sell well. It's going to release in paperback here in a few months, I think. It's continuing. I'm getting stories from all over the country every week of, somebody giving it to a pastor and the pastor giving it to lots of other pastors and all the pastors getting together to figure out how to start classical Christian schools. We've had a huge boom in classical Christian schools. And I know you guys have seen tremendous growth in the homeschool side.
Yeah. No, the more people that can be in a true classical Christian school, whether it's a private ACCS school or homeschooling, that's okay with us. So that's awesome to hear. And yeah, we've seen a tremendous amount of interest from individuals that you would never think would be interested in classical education. And I think a lot of it does go back to the travesty and the heartbreak that we see in the young people in our government schools today, and how you try to feed self. It's a ever consuming fire that's never satisfied. So tell me a little bit about how you got into the classical Christian education movement. Is this something that you had kids and got involved in, or is that something that has always been of interest to you?
Yeah, so that was kind of one of those stories where I got into it and then grew into it. I really grew into it more than got into it. Initially, I was working with youth groups in the early 90s, and it was at that time I noticed that even the ability to read scripture was really limited for, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20-year-olds. They couldn't really, they took a very wooden approach to it. They didn't really connect the Old Testament to the New Testament. There wasn't a lot of, and I realized a lot of it was because they hadn't had a lot of literature training. They didn't know how literature worked. Of course, scripture is literature, but it's also revealed truth. So in that context, I got involved with a school to try and help improve that. It was a classical Christian school. So it sounded like it focused on literature, but I didn't know what it was at the time. And then over the next 5 to 7 years, I came under the tutelage of Andrew Kern, who's somebody some people know in our movement. He trained me largely in the big picture of what classical Christian education was. And that's where I had this epiphany of how big this topic could be. I left my job in the tech sector in about 2003, went to work for the Ambrose School in Boise. And at the time, it was a small 160 student school. It's since grown. But the more I got into it, the deeper the well was. Sometimes I liken it to anybody who's had the experience of being in an old city like London or something. I don't know if you ever had this experience, but you see a shop that has a door and it's like 8 feet wide, the whole storefront is, and you walk in there and figure out that this thing actually is 10 floors high. And, there's all this, it goes way back and opens up and, there's all kinds of stuff, maybe even a courtyard back there. That's kind of what it was like for me. I went into a door that I thought was clever and small, and it turned out to be very big and very interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it is very large and very interesting. I was at my C12 group yesterday, and one of the questions was, "How well do you know the Bible?" And it was on a graph, and on the left side of the graph was not very well, and on the right side is like, I know it intimately, I know it very well. I was like, I think the farther you try to get right, the farther you go left.
Yes.
And I think that's what classical education is. The more you know, the more you realize you don't know anything.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yep, that's certainly true.
Yeah. Have you seen a lot of traditional schools maybe try to go classical over the last couple years since classical education has become more popular? I don't know if those are the type of things you see at ACCS, where like we have a private school, but we're wanting to.
Yeah, we have. It's very challenging for them to do it. We have a category of membership for that. It's called a transitional school. So if you go to our website at classicalchristian.org, go into the school finder, you can turn on and off various kinds of schools. And if you turn on the transitional school one, you'll see the schools across the country we're trying to help transition right now into classical Christian schools. It's a big challenge because typically it requires a different type of teaching, which often requires different teachers. Oftentimes, if it's a larger school, the parents didn't necessarily sign up for classical when they came in. So persuading them to move that direction. Classical, one of the lies that the progressives told us was that education is about content and method, which means education is just the stuff you teach. What knowledge will they have? What skills will they have? And methods for getting that information transferred into their minds. So it's very much of a computerized concept of what education is. And of course, as you know, classical education is, like I said, the cultivation of affections. It's virtue-based. It's rooted in finding truth. It's rooted in searching for truth and how to do that through logic and rhetoric. And those activities are very different. They're outside the scope of content and method. And so I think that many transition schools have a real challenge trying to get over that hump and realize that they've got to change everything about their school, right down to the DNA of it. So it's a challenge, but it can be done.
Now, what are some authors or speakers that inspire you? I know that a lot of our listeners might send their kids to classical schools or be in a classical conversations community. What are some resources that you recommend?
Well,
besides your book, obviously.
Yeah. Well, my book, the funny thing about it is I'm probably the least educated of the people in our circles that do this kind of thing. So,
well, I got you beat. So we got the two least educated people in the classical education chatting about it.
My benefit is I was trained in journalism. I worked in broadcasting initially way back when. And so what I do is I take what they say and I turn it into regular people talk, things that people can understand. So my book is really just especially chapters 3 through 10 are really just the cliff notes of classical education as its practice. So, guys in our current movement that I listen to a lot, like Martin Cothran, Chris Perrin, they're all the guys and I know, Andrew Kern, of course. Yeah. But the real gems, I think, come from history. C.S. Lewis, obviously, some of his works that don't get as much airplay, some of his works, like the Space Trilogy or Narnia, have so much story symbolism around classical ideas in them that we use them they're pretty influential, but you have to see them. And to see them, you almost have to find them through some other source. But Lewis writes a book called The Discarded Image, which I think is extremely helpful for homeschool moms. It's thick. It's actually a very thin book physically, but it's very dense, I guess is the word. Hard.
I've tried to read Abolition of Man. Well, I have read Abolition of Man, but you read like 2 pages at a time.
Yeah. Well, in Abolition of Man, the interesting thing about that one is you can read about the first 2 chapters and get the bulk of what's helpful for education, in my opinion. Then you've got the whole rest of the book is really engaging the Tao, or the Tao, T-A-O is how it's spelled. And that's complicated stuff. And that's where most people get bogged down. So I tell people, don't be afraid if you have to, kind of stop reading at some point. You probably got the bulk of the good stuff at the beginning. The Discarded Image is dense throughout and a little more difficult because it's one of his academic works, but it's worth it to go all the way through to the end because he builds out the medieval worldview in contrast to the modern worldview. And we're in worse shape now than we were when he wrote it with the problem that he's describing. So that's, he's been an influence. G.K. Chesterton, of course, a little easier to read than Lewis in some of these respects. And, I don't know, those are some of the influences. And of course, for me personally, Mortimer Adler has been one of the biggest influences on me. I've read most of what he wrote about education or just great books. And he's a 20th century guy as well.
Can you tell our audience a little bit about what the Association for Classical Christian Schools does? I mean, do you actually form the schools, or are you like a governing body? How do you serve those Christian schools in the classical movement?
We try and be servants to schools. We try and be the national kind of resource for people who need help starting schools. We don't want to run our own schools. We never have because we think classical education is a philosophy. Classical Christian education is a philosophy. There's a lot of different branches of that philosophy, and we just want to help people find the whole thing and be able to practically get these schools started. Last year, we had over 100 schools start and join us with our startup kit.
Praise the Lord.
Yeah, which is like 3 times the normal amount. And we're on pace again this year. So it's been a huge blessing to see that. But the ACCS exists really to serve schools. We have a massive resource called the Member Resource Center, which has, I think, somewhere around 800 conference talks, various training tools, lots of written examples of curriculum from various of the schools. And so we also accredit schools. Now that's a little different service. That's a service we provide to parents so that they can understand that the school that they're going to has been looked at by a body that has classical Christian roots, and we believe it to be a good school. So we do the accreditation. We do teacher certification as well. Kind of in a nutshell, what we're trying to do is, I said in the beginning of the interview that the progressives came in and took over all of the institutions that governed education so that they could control state graduation requirements and control teacher licensing and control accreditation and all these things. We just are trying to replace all of that progressive slag with instruments that are classical and Christian in nature. So we do all those sorts of things.
That's wonderful. You've been involved with this a long time. What is one God story or one way you've seen God move in these schools that you've helped be servants of?
You know, one of the blessings I've had is visiting a lot of schools. I've visited over 100 of the schools that are in our association, and some of them, many of them are in church basements, shopping malls, squirreled away. And sometimes I was at one in Florida not long ago that was squirreled away in a series of houses that they'd managed to buy on the same street. And you walk into these things thinking, okay, this is going to be kind of slipshod. And the kids are amazing. Just what you see. I wish people could see it. I'm sure you see it in the homeschool movement as well. These kids love God. They love their neighbors. They sing beautifully. They're artists, but they're also thinkers. You can talk to them about, I can sit at whatever type of lunch table they may have and talk to them about just about anything. So I guess what I see God working in here is, what does worldview Christianity look like? And when you visit these schools, you see it by and large.
Yeah, I know like Barna does a study where they define a biblical worldview, and that number seems to be dropping every single year. So I think it might be the ACCS schools and CC communities that are hopefully going to help bring that number back up here in the United States and around the world.
I would just point people, a couple of years ago, we commissioned the University of Notre Dame to do a study on the worldview outcomes of students at classical Christian schools. The report from that is called the Good Soil Study. It's available at classicalchristian.org. So
yes,
it's a good companion for the Barna work, because you can see what is the difference with a classical Christian student.
100%. I've always wondered, now that you brought it up, because it has classical schools. It also says private schools, I think home schools, public schools, charter schools, it breaks it down. Now we're kind of homeschooling. We're also that classical Christian school. So I feel like we need to get back in there, and I need to pay them to finish the study out and see what classical homeschoolers.
Yes.
where we rank in there.
Yeah, the way we did the study, obviously it's a massive study, and it would have been too expensive for our association to afford.
Sure.
Except for that they'd already done the study for all of the other segments besides the ACCS with another organization, a big foundation. So unfortunately, we couldn't single out homeschool classically because there are some weaknesses that you see in the study with regard to homeschools, but I don't think they'd be reflective of classical Christian homeschools. I think but of course we can't know because the data, the way we did the study, because there were thousands
Sure.
of interviews done of alumni from 24 to 45. So we couldn't control what a homeschooler was called or what type of homeschooler we were talking to.
All right. All right. Go check it out with that knowledge.
Yeah,
The homeschooling is not talking about classical Christian homeschooling.
quite true. Your kids are probably much closer to our audience.
Yes. So what have you seen? I mean, you've been you worked at the Ambrose School. I believe you're a board member now. You've seen it grow. What was it facing 20 years ago, and what is it facing now? How has that changed?
Well, 20 years ago, we were trying to convince people that it was safe to send their kids to a classical Christian school, that they weren't going to, come out completely unable to handle college and unable to, do science or anything like that. Now, this is a blessing of the Lord and just the timing. The biggest problem that Ambrose has at this moment is the growth. It's full, and so we started other schools around town trying to fill. We're trying to start satellite schools because we want every kid who wants a classical Christian education to be able to get one. And so we have a homeschool co-op version of it that runs. It's more of a shared instructional model, which is a little more structured than classical conversations. And of course, a lot of people in this area, a very big group, depend on classical conversations. That's the beauty of your program, is that it can scale to cover an entire city, whereas we can't scale that fast. We just don't have the resources. So right now, growth and scale is our biggest problem.
Well, I love it. I mean, I love that that's the problem. And we hear that at other classical schools. Our local classical school here in Southern Pines, which we support, they have a waiting list as well. And so, of course, it makes us sad that there was waiting list, but it's a totally different beast than, like you said, 20 years ago. And we were just trying to convince them that they weren't going to screw up their kids if they gave us a chance.
Yeah. Yep.
Tell us a little bit. You also write the Classical Christian Times. It's a newsletter that you publish on Substack, and I'm sure many of my listeners, if they don't know about it, would love to read it. So tell us a little bit about what you talk about in the Classical Christian Times.
Yeah, that was a project we engaged in when the book released, because the book is hitting a very different audience than we usually reach with classical Christian education. So a lot of Fox viewers, a lot of conservatives, some of them for the first time are coming into the Christian world. I think that's one of the exciting things for me. So I wanted to have a way to speak to people that was inside classical Christian education, but also spoke to those who were just finding us. And so it's a bridge, really. That's why it has a little different mission. It's trying to take current events and look at them. One of the things about classical Christian education, as I know you know, is that it is expansive on what it touches. It touches everything. It'll touch,
Yes,
everything from the hot issues of today with homosexuality or,
bank failures.
piety in the church. I mean, just pretty much everything. And it connects it to Scripture. And that's what we are in this for, really. And so what I try and do is connect people and explain things that they may not understand. So one of the most popular pieces I did on there is called Why Public Schools Are a Lost Cause. And that was popular because I just do a conversation between a school board. It's imagined, but I've seen this conversation happen so many times I could imagine it out of facts. It's imagined between a superintendent who's trying to help the school board and the school board that's trying to fix the wokeness, and nothing can be done. So those kind of things are the most popular stuff on there.
Sounds fun. I'll have to go check that out.
I think it's David Goodwin at Substack or .substack.com or something like that.
Our researchers will definitely put in the show notes a link to your Substack. So if you check that out, if you're listening on your favorite device, go afterwards and go check out the link below. Now, are you working on anything else? And if some people want to reach you, what's the best way to connect with David Goodwin?
Good question. Yeah, I am working at the moment on another book. The next book that HarperCollins asked me to do is on how to do classical Christian education. You and I both know that there have been many books over the years that kind of address elements of that, but they wanted more of a field guide to, if you want to do it, how do you do it? So I'm writing that right now. It should be out maybe late this year or early next year. So it should be a good guide for people. I hope. And I'm continuing, on the speaking tour for these. I had a pretty extensive speaking tour planned. Pete's been doing most of them for me. I had some health issues that held me back, but I'm about ready to go back on the road for that. So I'm working on that. And
yeah, we missed you here, but we got to say hi to Pete.
Yes. I thought it's been a blessing to have him help carry the load on this stuff. And he's a good speaker, so he's fun to listen to. And he's pretty sold on it. He moved his family out of New York and moved them into Nashville. So just for that purpose.
Yeah. It was fun to sit down with him and talk to him and hear his story, because you see these people on TV and you think, are they really like us, or what is it like to be a celebrity or a Fox News host or whatnot, and then to see him fired up about classical Christian education and just the delight in his eye it was fun to see. So
yeah,
great.
If you go to battlefortheamericanmind.com, which is our website for the book, there's a interview series we did at the Reagan Library in California that's pretty fun to watch. Pete does well there. I think it's pretty good thing if people want to learn more about the book.
He's had a little bit of TV training, so.
Yeah, he is telegenic, as they say.
Awesome. So give me those websites one more time.
Well, the book is battlefortheamericanmind.com, all just spelled out, all one word, battlefortheamericanmind.com. And then classicalchristian.org is our primary website for starting and running schools. We also have Classical Difference, classicaldifference.com. Those two are more for people who are just learning about classical education, want to learn more. So those are the big ones. And then, of course, David Goodwin davidgoodwin.substack.com for the Classical Christian Times.
Well, David, thank you for spending some time and enlightening us on the classical education and what it's like writing a New York Times #1 bestseller. And best of luck, and love being in this battle with you guys and all the stuff that ACCS schools are doing around this country. So
can't say enough how much I appreciate classical conversations. Thanks, Rob.
Now let's practice the 15 tools of learning, talking and using our current events, what's going on around us. And one of the things that's going on is a fight about Title IX, which is an equal opportunity law. It's really one that would made sure that women would have the same opportunities as men. One of the ways you think about it is collegiate sports. People or colleges, universities that take federal dollars have to make sure that they spend an equally proportionate amount on women's sports as male sports. It also makes sure that women have like their own locker rooms or own spaces that are free from male spaces. So women don't have to use the men's locker room to change and those things that were historically going on. So there's a fight to change what Title IX means, and we can use the tools of learning to try to figure that out. So we want to do attending, which is differentiating from known ideas. And there's two ideas that we would want to attend to. One is Joe Biden and the Democrats are working on making laws through bureaucracy, where if you take federal dollars, that you have to view an individual on how they are currently identifying themselves. So you don't necessarily have to have a men's and a women's restroom that are separate based on biological birth genitalia, but whatever that individual is identifying with at that moment, whether they identified that way yesterday or identifying that way tomorrow, doesn't matter, that they can use the bathroom and facilities of their choosing. And not that they're encouraging this, but they'll be requiring it for those entities, which is hospitals, colleges, et cetera, et cetera. The House GOP has passed a law in late April that protects biological women and keeps those spaces sacred to themselves. So that's the way the two political parties are using or trying to modify Title IX to make clear how to engage in this at a federal level. Now, the relationship is a tool, the 5 common topics, discovering cause and effects. So, why did we need Title IX, or why did the politicians decide to pass Title IX? Well, they felt like opportunities were not evenly divided, that funding from the government was being used in a way to benefit one sex over another. And so they wanted to force entities to proportionately invest in both of them, as well as to ensure that females had a safe space, their own areas to go into. Now, the style, which is one of the 5 canons of rhetoric, choosing the best way to present thoughts and ideas. One of those ways that the House GOP took upon themselves is through legislation and putting it down on paper and having a vote. And 100% of GOP voted for it. That did vote. A couple people had abstained. For what reason, I don't know. And 0 out of all of the Democrats in the House voted for it. Now, it's not expected to be taken up by the Senate, so it's probably dead in the current water. Versus the other style is bureaucracy, and that is how the president's office is deciding to go about this, is by changing the rules through unelected bureaucrats and by really proclamation of saying, hey, if you take federal dollars, that you have to recognize the person's not birth identity, but however they are identifying at that moment. Well, that's something that's going